Let me ask you something. When was the last time you walked into a room and felt it? Not thought about it, not hoped for it, but actually felt it. That quiet, steady sense that you belong there, that people notice, that she notices. Most men over 45 have forgotten what that feels like. And the worst part? They've been told a lie. A very convincing, very well-meaning lie that has quietly cost them years of connection, confidence, and genuine attraction. The lie goes something like this. If you want a woman to desire you, you need to say the right thing at the right moment. You need to be charming. You need to be funny. You need to know the perfect line, the perfect compliment, the perfect move. That is wrong. And not just a little wrong. It is fundamentally, biologically, psychologically wrong. Lower voice confidential. But here's the truth no one tells you. Calm, assured, the most attractive men in any room aren't saying more. They are saying less. They are choosing their words with a kind of quiet precision that bypasses logic entirely and speaks directly to something much older, much deeper, and much more powerful in the human brain. And once you understand what is actually happening in those moments, the neuroscience, the psychology, the biology of it, you will never look at a conversation with a woman the same way again. My name is Dr. Sarah Whitman. I am a behavioral psychologist and men's wellness specialist with over 22 years of clinical and consulting work focused exclusively on men in their 40s, 50s, and beyond. I have worked with executives, with recently divorced men who felt completely invisible, with widowers re-entering a social world that felt utterly foreign, with men who, by every external measure, had everything going for them, and yet felt deeply, quietly disconnected from the masculine vitality they once had. What I have found, consistently, is not what most people expect. These men did not lack intelligence. They did not lack ambition. They did not lack a genuine desire to connect with women in meaningful, authentic ways. What they lacked was something far more foundational, something no pickup artist book, no dating coach, and no weekend seminar had ever addressed properly. They lacked a working understanding of how attraction actually forms in the brain, particularly how it forms in response to language, presence, and the subtle psychological signals that a man projects without ever being consciously aware of it. Let's go through them one by one. The first forbidden phrase, I noticed something about you. I want you to sit with that for a moment. Not, you look beautiful. Not, I love your dress. Not, you're so interesting. All of which, by the way, are perfectly nice things to say, and almost completely ineffective as attractors. I noticed something about you. Why does this work where the others fail? Let's go back to the neuroscience. The human brain has a very specific and very powerful response to being observed accurately. Psychologists call this phenomenon the feeling of being truly seen, and it activates the same neural pathways as emotional intimacy. When someone demonstrates that they have paid careful, perceptive attention to you, not to your surface, not to what you're presenting to the world, but to something real and specific and subtle, the brain releases oxytocin. Oxytocin is sometimes called the bonding hormone, but that is an oversimplification. What oxytocin actually does is lower the threat response. It creates a sense of psychological safety. It makes the brain say, I can trust this person. And trust, in the biology of attraction, is the gateway through which desire travels. When a man says, I notice something about you, he is doing several things simultaneously that most men never manage to do with far more elaborate attempts. First, he is demonstrating that he observes rather than just looks. Most people look, very few observe. Observation requires presence, patience, and genuine interest. And presence is one of the rarest and most attractive qualities a human being can possess. Second, he is creating a curiosity gap. The brain hates incomplete information. The moment she hears, I noticed something about you, her entire cognitive architecture swings toward one question. What did you notice? That question, that forward lean into the unknown, is the neurological precursor to engagement. She is now invested in the conversation before it has truly begun. Third, and this is the part most men completely miss, he has not told her what he noticed yet. He has created a space, a moment of anticipation. And anticipation, as every neuroscientist studying reward systems will tell you, is more activating than gratification. But, and this is critical, the phrase only works if what follows it is real. It cannot be a compliment dressed in perceptive clothing. It cannot be, I noticed something about you, you're really beautiful. That collapses the entire structure. What follows needs to be genuinely, specifically observational. I noticed something about you the way you listened when she was talking. Most people are already composing their response. You actually listen. Or, I noticed something about you. You seem comfortable with silence. That's unusual. Or, I noticed something about you. You hold yourself like someone who's been through something difficult and came out the other side of it. These observations do something remarkable. They tell her that she has been seen, not performed for, not flattered, but actually witnessed. And for many women, particularly women over 40, that experience is so rare it is almost disorienting. That disorientation is what you want. It is the first fracture in the automatic, defensive social scripts that most interactions never get past. The second forbidden phrase, you don't have to perform for me. Stay with me here, because this one is going to seem strange at first. Most men, when they are attracted to a woman, do what the culture has trained them to do. They perform. They make themselves interesting. They tell better stories. They stand taller, talk more, try harder. And what they do not realize is that they are, in doing so, creating a social dynamic built entirely on performance and inviting her to match it. Because here is what nobody talks about. Women perform too, constantly, relentlessly. They adjust, they manage impressions, they soften edges and amplify appeal, and navigate the unspoken expectations of almost every social interaction they have. It is exhausting. It is so normalized, they often do not even recognize it as performance. But when it stops when someone explicitly removes the obligation, the relief is profound. You don't have to perform for me is not just a phrase. It is a declaration of psychological safety. It tells her, at the level of the nervous system, there is no test here. You do not have to be more charming or more interesting or more beautiful than you are. What you actually are is enough for this conversation. The neurological effect of this is significant. When the social performance pressure lifts, oxytocin rises, cortisol drops. The prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for impression management and social calculation, releases its grip slightly. And what emerges from underneath all of that defensive machinery is something genuine, something real, something that is actually her. And when a man creates the conditions for that kind of authentic emergence, when he is the person in whose presence a woman can simply be, she begins to associate that feeling with him. Safety becomes connection. Connection begins to shade toward something warmer. Now, the delivery of this phrase matters enormously. It cannot be delivered as a line. It cannot be said with a knowing smirk or a therapist's head tilt. It must be said simply, matter-of-factly, with the calm of a man who genuinely means it and does not need anything from her in response to it. That quality, saying something genuine, without needing a response, without waiting to see if it landed, without adjusting his expression to read her reaction, is itself a demonstration of the very groundedness we discussed earlier. And groundedness, remember, is one of the primary biological attractors. There is another layer here worth understanding. When a man says, "You don't have to perform for me," and genuinely means it, he is implicitly communicating something about himself, that he is not performing either, that he is not here to impress or to audition or to win something. He is simply here, present and unhurried, because he has enough internal stability to simply exist in a conversation without needing it to become something. That quality internal sufficiency, the psychologists call it, is extraordinarily rare in men of any age. And it is magnetic in ways that are genuinely difficult to overstate. The third forbidden phrase, I'm not going to try to convince you. This is perhaps the most counterintuitive phrase of all five. Every social instinct a man has developed over 40 or 50 years tells him to make the case, to argue for himself, to list his qualifications, his intentions, his reasons why she should trust him or like him or give him a chance. To be persuasive. And every time he does, he loses. Here is why. The brain has a well-documented phenomenon called psychological reactance. It was first identified by the psychologist Jack Brem in the 1960s, and it describes something fundamentally human. When we feel that our freedom of choice is being threatened, when someone is trying to push us toward a conclusion, we instinctively resist. Not because we necessarily disagree with the conclusion, but because the brain values autonomy above almost everything else. When a man works to convince a woman of anything, of his worthiness, of his intentions, of why she should spend time with him, he is activating her reactance response. He is, without knowing it, positioning himself as a force that needs to be resisted. And the more persuasive he is, the stronger the resistance he triggers. "I'm not going to try to convince you" dismantles that entire dynamic in one sentence. It does several things at once. It removes pressure, which lowers cortisol. It demonstrates confidence, because only a man who genuinely believes in his own value can afford to make that statement. And it creates, paradoxically, a stronger pull toward him, because the moment the pressure lifts, the brain's natural curiosity reasserts itself. There is a concept in behavioral economics called the scarcity effect, and while it is usually applied to objects and resources, it operates identically in social dynamics. When something is freely available, constantly offered, constantly pressed, the perceived value drops. When something is held at a slight distance, when it does not chase, when it exists with quiet self-sufficiency, the perceived value rises. "I'm not going to try to convince you" is a scarcity signal. It says, "I exist, I am here, but my presence is not contingent on your approval, and I will not compromise my dignity to secure it." That signal, transmitted cleanly through those 7 words, registers in the brain as high value, as someone worth paying attention to. There is a timing element here as well. This phrase works best not as an opener, but as a response often to a moment of skepticism or hesitation. She expresses doubt or distance or a kind of low-level test that most men fail by trying harder. And instead of trying harder, you say, simply and warmly, "I'm not going to try to convince you. You'll figure out what's true when you're ready." And then you return to the conversation as if nothing happened. That composure, in that moment, speaks louder than any argument you could have made. The 4th forbidden phrase, "I think you know more than you're saying." Let me tell you what this phrase does inside the brain. One of the deepest psychological needs human beings carry, and this is remarkably well documented in the literature on attachment and belonging, is the need to be known. Not just liked, not just desired, but genuinely known, seen past the surface into something truer. "I think you know more than you're saying" is an invitation to depth. It is an implicit message that says, "I see something in you that is richer and more complex than what you are showing, and I am interested in that." And for a woman who has spent years, possibly decades, either being read at surface level by men or performing the version of herself she thought was expected, that invitation is profound. The phrase also does something neurologically interesting. It creates a mild form of what psychologists call cognitive elaboration. It asks the brain to examine itself, to go inward, to retrieve something. And in doing so, it shifts the dynamic of the conversation from exchange to exploration. She is no longer just talking to someone. She is beginning to discover something about herself through talking to him. This is one of the most powerful relational dynamics a man can create. When a woman discovers things about herself in your presence, she associates that discovery with you. The sense of expansion, of being understood, of having permission to be more. She begins to want more of that feeling. And you are the source of it. But again, this phrase must emerge from genuine observation, not formula. It works when you have actually been listening, when you have actually noticed the gap between what she is saying and what her face or her eyes or her hesitation is suggesting. It works when it is accurate. When it is accurate, it lands like a key turning in a lock. When it is fabricated, it lands like flattery, and she knows the difference immediately. The delivery should be calm, curious, not probing or challenging, but genuinely interested, said with a slight tilt of the head, a pause, a quality of attention that suggests you have all the time in the world and nowhere more interesting to be than right here. That quality of unhurried presence, the willingness to simply wait in a moment without filling it, without rushing toward resolution, is something so few men demonstrate that it alone sets a man apart before he has said anything at all. The fifth forbidden phrase, I already respect you, you don't have to earn it. Of all 5 phrases, this is the one that men most often underestimate, and it is the one that, properly delivered, lands with the most force. Here is the psychology. Respect is something most adults, and particularly most women who have navigated a world that has historically granted it conditionally, experience as something that must be earned, must be performed for, must be maintained through continuous demonstration of worth. This is exhausting, and it is so normalized that most people do not realize they are living inside of it. When a man looks at a woman and says simply and calmly, I already respect you, you don't have to earn it, he is doing something almost unprecedented in her social experience. He is offering unconditional regard, not romantic infatuation, not flattery, but basic human respect without terms, without a performance requirement attached. The oxytocin response to this is immediate and significant. The threat response drops. The defensive social machinery stands down. And what fills that space is something that feels very much like relief. And relief, when it comes from a person, is one of the fastest pathways to emotional bonding that exists. But there is another layer. A man who offers respect freely, without conditions, without making it a reward for behavior, that man is communicating something extremely important about himself. He is communicating that his emotional responses are not transactional, that he operates from a position of genuine sufficiency, that he does not use his approval as a currency, does not use his regard as leverage. In a culture that has become profoundly transactional in almost every intimate domain, a man who operates outside that economy is startling, disarming, deeply attractive. And here is the thing that pulls it all together. These 5 phrases individually are powerful. Collectively, they compose something more important than a collection of effective lines. They compose a way of being in conversation, a posture, a presence, the kind of man who notices what others miss, who offers safety in a world that rarely provides it, who does not chase or convince or perform, who sees past the surface and respects what he finds there. That man is not common. And in a world of uncommon scarcity, the uncommon is irresistible. Now here is where I need to speak honestly, directly, and perhaps a bit uncomfortably. Everything I have just described, the calm, the groundedness, the genuine observational presence, the ability to hold space without needing anything from it, all of it depends on one thing that no phrase can manufacture. It depends on the internal state of the man using it. You can memorize all 5 phrases. You can practice them in a mirror. You can deploy them with textbook precision. And if the man deploying them is internally anxious, approval-seeking, hormonally depleted, and physiologically in a constant, low-grade stress response, they will not work. Or rather, they will work just enough to briefly interest someone before the underlying state bleeds through and undermines the entire impression. This is the part of the conversation that most men's coaches and most dating advice columns never address, because it is not a language problem, it is a physiology problem. The groundedness I have been describing, the calm, unhurried, internally sufficient masculine presence, is not primarily a mindset. It is not something you can simply decide to feel. It is, in very large part, a biological state. It is produced by a nervous system that is well regulated, by a hormonal profile that supports confidence and stillness, by a body and brain that are getting what they need. And this is where the men I work with most need to hear something they are not being told. After 45, the decline in testosterone, the rise in cortisol from chronic stress, the disruption of sleep architecture, the neurological effects of a sedentary lifestyle, and a diet that never considered what it was doing to the endocrine system, These are not small background variables. They are the primary factors determining how a man shows up in every room he walks into, in every conversation he has, in every moment where presence either manifests or it doesn't. After 45, the factory begins producing less testosterone, not because it has forgotten how, but because it is receiving signals that suggest the environment does not require it. Chronic stress tells the factory to prioritize cortisol. Poor sleep disrupts the hormonal synthesis cycle. Sedentary behavior removes the mechanical signals that trigger testosterone production. A diet high in refined carbohydrates and low in certain essential micronutrients removes the raw materials the factory needs. Let me tell you about the pathway that most approaches completely ignore. The primary reason that standard interventions, whether we are talking about basic testosterone support protocols, generic exercise programs, or even reasonable dietary adjustments, fail to produce lasting change in how a man feels and carries himself is this. They address the symptoms of factory decline without addressing the signaling environment that caused the decline in the first place. Think of it this way. Imagine a factory whose production has been dropping steadily because the roads that deliver raw materials to the facility have become congested, damaged, and unreliable. You can spend a great deal of money improving the machinery inside the factory. You can upgrade the equipment, you can hire better workers, but if the roads are still congested and the raw materials are still not arriving reliably, the improvements to the factory itself will be modest at best. What you need to do what almost nobody is doing is fix the roads. In biological terms, those roads are the pathways of nutrient absorption, hormonal precursor delivery, inflammation regulation, and the mitochondrial health that underlies every other system in the body. When these pathways are compromised, and in most men over 45 they are, quietly and significantly compromised, everything downstream suffers. The energy suffers, the mood suffers, the cognitive clarity suffers, the hormonal profile suffers, and the quality of masculine presence suffers most of all. Because masculine presence requires a biological platform that most men are simply not maintaining. Now, here is the good news, and I mean this genuinely, based on what I have observed across 22 years of working with men in this age range. The factory can be restored, the roads can be repaired, and when the right inputs arrive consistently and the right conditions are established, the response in most men is not gradual. It is not incremental. It is, frankly, surprising. Men report it as a shift, a return, a sense of stepping back into a self they had almost forgotten. And the changes are not only physical. They are, perhaps more importantly, psychological. The calm returns, the clarity returns, the unhurried quality of presence returns. The ability to walk into a room and simply be there, without anxiety or performance, without the low-grade scramble for approval, it returns. And when that returns, everything I have described about the 5 phrases begins to function as it is meant to. Because now they are not lines. They are expressions of a real internal state. They are language arising from genuine groundedness. Let me tell you what that feels like in practical terms. Because this is not abstract and it is not theoretical. I have observed this transformation in men, repeatedly, across more than 2 decades of clinical work. It starts in the morning. Not dramatically. Not with a sudden epiphany. It starts with the absence of something. The absence of the low-grade fatigue that had become so normal, the man had stopped noticing it as abnormal. He wakes up, and the first few seconds before full consciousness arrives, there is something there. A kind of readiness, a sense of resource. Over the following weeks, the physical clarity deepens. The cognitive fog, which most men over 45 have accepted as simply how thinking feels now, begins to lift. Thoughts arrive more quickly, connect more fluidly, hold their shape longer. Conversations become more engaging because the brain is genuinely present in them, rather than operating at 70% capacity. Then the emotional dimension shifts. The reactivity softens. The small irritations, the traffic, the slow internet, the conversation that isn't going the way it should, stop landing with the same disproportionate weight. There is more space between stimulus and response. That space is what presence feels like from the inside. And then, perhaps most importantly, Something happens in social situations. A man who has restored this internal state walks into a room differently. Not because he has decided to stand taller, not because he has practiced a confident posture, but because his nervous system is no longer producing the low-grade cortisol signal of vigilance and inadequacy. His body has a different default, and that default, that embodied biological calm, is perceived by every person in that room, often within seconds, through mechanisms that neither party is consciously aware of. The women in that room notice it first, because women have, on average, more finely calibrated social neurological systems, the product of millennia of evolutionary pressure toward accurate threat and value assessment in social environments. They notice the man who is simply there, who is not performing, who is not trying to be noticed, who seems, somehow, sufficient. That is the man who can use the 5 phrases. That is the man for whom those words become expressions of something real, rather than attempts to manufacture something absent. And that is the man that others want to be near. So let me leave you with this. You are not old. You are not past the point of change. You are not sentenced to the slow dimming of everything that once made you feel alive and present and attractive and capable. What you may be, and I say this with the deepest respect because I have sat across from enough men in this position to recognize it. What you may be is uninformed, operating on an outdated model of your own biology, working hard at solutions that address symptoms while leaving the root causes untouched.